So for the first time in 5 whole years, Donald Trump sat down for an interview with 60 Minutes. And what we got was a pretty combative 90-minute conversation that gives us a really rare look into his priorities 9 months into his second term. So what we're going to do is break down the most revealing moments, everything from nuclear policy to how he's using his presidential power.
Right out of the gate, before the interview even really got going, Trump was on the offensive. He opened with this claim about being paid, which, immediately framed the whole thing not just as an interview, but as a kind of confrontation. And wow, did that set the tone for the next 90 minutes.
But you gotta understand, this interview didn't just happen in a vacuum. The backstory here is pretty crucial. It came right after CBS's parent company paid a $16 million lawsuit settlement to Trump. Plus, you have new leadership at CBS News, and only a fraction of the full 90-minute conversation actually made it to air. So yeah, the dynamics were tense from the very start. Okay, so to really unpack this thing, we're gonna look at it in 4 parts. First, we'll start on the world stage. Then we'll dive into the pressing issues right here at home. After that, we'll get into his controversial use of political power, and finally, we'll pull back and look at the big picture. The interview really kicked off with the heavy stuff. High-stakes questions about America's relationship with China, its stance on Russia, and, of course, the ever-present threat of nuclear weapons. When the topic turned to China, Trump basically claimed a total victory. He presented a new trade deal as this massive win, saying he'd neutralized China's control over rare earth minerals, which, are absolutely vital for modern tech. And then he drew a really hard line, declaring America's most advanced semiconductor chips would be completely off-limits to Beijing. And then the conversation led to one of the most direct, factual clashes of the whole night. Trump said he was resuming U.S. nuclear testing because, in his words, Russia and China were already doing it. But the interviewer, Norah O'Donnell, pushed right back, saying, wait a minute, only North Korea is actively testing. Trump didn't budge an inch, just insisted the others were doing it in secret. A little closer to home, the focus shifted over to Venezuela. With a U.S. aircraft carrier parked nearby, he was asked directly, are we going to war? He kind of brushed off the idea, but then, in the very next breath, added that President Maduro's days were numbered, which leaves the door wide open for pretty much anything. All right, so from the world stage, the interview pivoted right back here, tackling the big domestic issues, the economy, immigration, and that government shutdown that was looming.
So when it came to the economy, Trump's go-to piece of evidence for success was the stock market. He pointed out that it had hit an all-time high 48 times in just 9 months. For him, this was all the proof you needed that his policies were creating just incredible prosperity.
But what about inflation? What about the rising cost of groceries that everybody's feeling? Well, when he was challenged on this, he basically dismissed the whole concern. He claimed any price hikes were just leftovers from the Biden administration and insisted that on his watch, costs are actually going down. From pocketbook issues, the conversation then turned to one of the most charged topics of his term, the aggressive tactics of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. O'Donnell asked him point blank, have some of these raids gone too far? And his response? It could not have been more unambiguous. He didn't just defend the raids, he argued they hadn't gone far enough. He then put the blame for any kind of restraint squarely on what he called liberal judges, which pretty much signals a green light for even more aggressive tactics. And on the government shutdown, which at the time was dragging into its 33rd day, Trump placed all the responsibility on the Democrats. He used some pretty inflammatory language, calling them crazed lunatics and framing the whole stalemate as their fault for not negotiating. All right, next up, let's get into some of the most politically charged moments of the interview, where the discussion turned to his use of presidential power and his attacks on his political rivals.
So one of the most talked about moments was when he was asked about his recent pardon of Changpeng Zhao, who goes by CZ. Now, just for some quick context, CZ is the billionaire founder of the crypto exchange Binance, and he just served prison time for some serious financial crimes, including money laundering.
And Trump's justification for the pardon was pretty startling. He claimed he didn't even know who CZ was. He said he was just told that the guy was a victim of the Biden administration, and then drew a direct line between CZ's case and his own legal battles. He didn't stop there. He also weighed in on local politics, jumping right into the New York City mayoral race. He labeled the Democratic Socialist frontrunner, Zohran Mamdani, a communist, and then issued a pretty clear warning. If Mamdani wins, federal funding for the city could be on the chopping block.
But maybe the most striking moment of all came when he was asked about the Justice Department's recent indictments of his political foes, people like James Comey and Letitia James. When he was pressed on whether this was all just retribution, he described his own conduct as, quote, very mild-mannered.
So after all that, what can we really take away from this? Let's zoom out for a second and try to connect the dots to see what the big picture looks like. When you boil the entire 90-minute conversation down, three clear themes really jump out. First, you've got this assertive, confrontational, America-first approach to foreign policy. Second, there's an absolutely unyielding defense of his most aggressive domestic policies. And third, a consistent strategy. Blame everything on your predecessors and your political rivals.
Ultimately, this interview really is a clear snapshot of this presidency, 9 months into a second term. And it leaves us all with a pretty crucial question to think about. What does this interview really tell us about the administration's priorities, its strategies, and the conflicts we can probably expect to see over the next 3 years?